All right, let's dive into something you might not think about too much until you're stuck on a tarmac in a blizzard. Aircraft icing. You know, when ice builds up on a plane, we're going deep on this because it's more complex than just a little frost.
Yeah. What's fascinating here is how many people think de-icing is just about the wings.
Right.
But engine icing is a whole other beast.
Yeah.
And just as dangerous. They're totally independent problems, meaning both can happen at the same time.
And here's the thing that gets me. You're boarding a plane, maybe excited for a trip. Do you even know if it's built to handle ice?
Right.
Most people don't.
Exactly. Don't assume just because it flies using instruments, that's what IFR means, that it's ice ready.
So what if you're on a non-certified plane and ice hits?
Mm-hmm.
Do they turn around mid-flight?
Pretty much. Pilots are all about minimizing risk. It's drilled into them.
Yeah.
Flying into icing conditions without the right plane is like driving on bald tires in a snowstorm.
Yeah.
Bad idea.
Makes sense. Okay, so my plane is certified. Am I good to go, even in a blizzard?
Here's where the nuance comes in. Even certified planes have limits. Severe icing is dangerous for any aircraft. And freezing rain is like public enemy #1 in the aviation world.
Why is freezing rain so much worse than snow or sleet?
It forms this clear ice that's hard to see and sticks like glue. It messes with aerodynamics way more than the rough, opaque stuff called rime ice. Pilots try their best to avoid freezing rain altogether.
So under what conditions can we actually expect this icing to occur?
You need two things.
Okay.
Visible moisture, like clouds or precipitation, and a temperature at or below a certain threshold.
Okay.
It depends on the specific aircraft, but it's usually somewhere between 3 and 10 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so it's not just about how cold it is, it's about that combo.
Right.
Now, are some planes just inherently better at dealing with ice than others?
That's where size and performance come into play. A small, slower plane is at higher risk because it spends more time in those icy conditions, unable to climb quickly above them.
This is a bit like being stuck in rush hour traffic, but for icy air.
Exactly. Let's say a high-performance jet and a turboprop fly the same icy route. They might accumulate similar amounts of ice, but the jet, with its powerful de-icing systems and ability to climb quickly, is better equipped to handle it.
Ah, so it's a combination of better winter coat and being able to get out of the cold faster.
Spot on. And there's another factor most people don't think about, the angle of attack. That's the angle between the wing and the oncoming air. A steep takeoff in icy conditions could mean ice forming in areas not protected by de-icing systems. Not good.
So there's no magic temperature where it's just too cold for ice to form.
There's a myth that below -40 degrees Celsius, you're good. Powerful storms can still create those supercooled droplets that cause icing, even in extreme cold.
That's wild. So no matter how cold it is, there's still a chance of ice forming.
Exactly. And remember, for takeoff, those wings and tail, the empennage, need to be totally clean. That's where de-icing fluids come in. They remove existing ice and prevent new formation for a limited time.
Okay.
The holdover time.
So it's like a temporary force field against the ice.
You could say that, but holdover time isn't foolproof.
Okay.
Weather changes fast, and it's affected by things like temperature and precipitation. Visual checks are still crucial, though not always easy, especially at night.
Wait, so even with the fluid, ice can still sneak back on?
Unfortunately, yes. And another catch, those fluids aren't as effective against freezing rain or drizzle. That's why airlines often ground flights in those conditions.
Yeah.
It's just too risky.
Man, it sounds like icing is a constant battle, even with all these precautions in place.
It definitely highlights the challenges pilots face. Here's the thing. Even with certification and procedures, knowing the true extent of icing during flight is tough. Visual checks only go so far, especially at night. It's a reminder that pilots are dealing with a lot of uncertainty up there.
That's a little unnerving to think about.
Yeah.
So what's been the most surprising thing you've learned about icing and flight?
For me, it's the realization that even with certifications and de-icing, it's not a foolproof system. There's
Really?
always this element of risk, and pilots have to be constantly adapting and making judgment calls.
Yeah. It really makes you appreciate their skill and expertise.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's the fact that it's so hard to truly assess the icing conditions in flight. Makes you realize that even with technology, nature throws curveballs.
And it's not just the amount of ice, it's the type that matters. We've been talking about clear ice being the worst, but there are a few others to know about.
Okay, so it's like a whole icy taxonomy. Besides clear, what else is out there?
You've got Rime ice, which is the most common. It's rough, opaque, forms from those super cool droplets freezing instantly on impact. Think of it like the frost you get on your car windshield. That's rime ice.
Ah, so it's not as smooth and scary looking as clear ice.
Exactly. Rime ice is less dense, so less dangerous aerodynamically, but it can still disrupt airflow over the wings and tail, reducing lift and increasing drag.
Not ideal. And what about this mixed ice I've heard about? Sounds ominous.
Mixed ice is exactly what it sounds like, a combo of rime and clear.
Okay.
You get it when the temperature and water droplet size are fluctuating, the worst of both worlds.
So you've got this mix of rough and smooth ice clinging to your plane. What does that actually do to the aircraft's ability to fly?
It's all about airflow. Ice, no matter the type, disrupts that smooth flow over the wings and tail.
Right.
This reduces lift, which is what keeps you up there, and increases drag, which is working against you. Severe cases can lead to a stall where the plane suddenly loses lift.
That's the nightmare scenario, right? The plane just drops.
It can feel like that, and remember how clear ice is so sticky? That can cause control problems, making it harder for the pilot to maneuver.
So not only are you losing lift, but the plane's becoming harder to control?
Right.
Double whammy.
It gets worse. Ice can clog engine intakes, disrupt airflow through the engine itself. Even engine failure can happen.
Okay, that's officially terrifying. It's like the plane is choking on ice.
And to add insult to injury, ice can mess with instruments and sensors too, giving pilots bad readings.
Wow. This is way more complex than I ever imagined. It's not just about avoiding a bit of frost. It's about understanding how this stuff can impact every part of the flight.
Which is why pilots are so meticulous about dealing with it. They're trained to avoid it whenever possible.
So what do they do to mitigate the risk? Apart from the obvious, don't fly into a blizzard.
Flight planning is huge. Using weather forecasts to avoid those icy zones is priority number one, but sometimes it's unavoidable. Adjusting airspeed can minimize ice buildup, and of course, using those de-icing systems we talked about. Some use heated air to melt the ice, others have inflatable boots to break it off the wings and tail.
So it's like having little icebreakers right on the plane.
Exactly. And sometimes the safest option is to divert to a different airport altogether.
It's incredible how much goes into managing this one issue. Pilots are making these calls in real time, under pressure. Respect. Knowing your plane and your route is empowering. And while icing is serious, you're saying we shouldn't panic, just be informed.
Right. Airlines have procedures to manage these risks. Understanding the science behind it and the measures taken can make you a more confident flyer, especially in winter.
This has been eye-opening, honestly. Before we move on, what's the one thing you really want listeners to remember about icing and flight safety?
That it's complex, potentially dangerous, but manageable. With the right knowledge, precautions, and continuous learning from past events, we can make flying safer.
Well said. And for me, the big takeaway is how skilled pilots are at dealing with this.
Right.
Next time I'm on a winter flight, I'll definitely be thinking about everything they're doing to keep us safe.
It's a team effort, for sure.
Speaking of teams, in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to look at how this all plays out in the real world. We'll be exploring some case studies that show the impact of icing on aviation history, both the triumphs and the tragedies. Stay with us. We've talked about the science, the procedures, the challenges pilots face, but sometimes the best way to understand something is to see how it plays out in real life.
Absolutely. And when it comes to aircraft icing, history is full of stories, some inspiring, some heartbreaking, that really drive home the points we've been discussing.
So let's get into those case studies. What story are we starting with?
One that's seared into aviation history. Air Florida Flight 90 back in 1982. It's a stark reminder of how even seemingly small oversights can have devastating consequences.
This was the flight that crashed into the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C., right? A snowy day, if I remember correctly.
Tragically, yes. Heavy snow, freezing temperatures. The Boeing 737 sat on the tarmac for over an hour, accumulating snow and ice, and that's where the problems began.
What happened? Was it a de-icing issue?
Exactly the de-icing procedures. They weren't followed properly. The fluid used wasn't sufficient for those conditions, and the pre-flight check, well, it wasn't thorough enough. Ice remained on critical surfaces.
So they took off with ice still on the plane. Knowing the risks we've talked about, that's hard to believe.
It's a tragic illustration of how multiple small errors can cascade into a catastrophe. As the plane tried to take off, the ice disrupted airflow, reducing lift. The pilots fought to control it, but it wasn't enough. They crashed moments after leaving the runway.
How many people were on board?
74 passengers, 5 crew. Only 5 people survived.
It's a sobering reminder of why these procedures exist and why they need to be followed meticulously.
Absolutely. It also highlighted the need for pilots to speak up if they have concerns about de-icing. You're in charge of that aircraft, and your judgment is critical.
It's a team effort, but the pilot ultimately bears the responsibility. What impact did this tragedy have on aviation safety? Did anything change because of it?
It led to significant changes, thankfully. Stricter adherence to de-icing procedures, better pilot training on icing conditions, improvements in weather forecasting, all crucial steps forward.
It's good to know that something positive came out of such a terrible event, but it's also a reminder that we're always learning, always refining procedures to minimize risk.
Exactly. Let's look at another case, this time involving a smaller aircraft. Commuter Airlines Flight 3272 in 1997. An Embraer 120 turboprop, it crashed approaching Detroit in icy conditions.
We talked earlier about smaller planes being more susceptible to icing. Did that play a role here?
Absolutely. This case highlights the challenges those smaller aircraft face, especially those without sophisticated de-icing systems. They encountered freezing rain, ice built up, and while the pilots were aware of the conditions, they thought they could manage the approach and land safely.
So they underestimated the danger.
It appears so. They likely misjudged how much the ice was affecting the plane's handling. As they descended, the airflow was disrupted, leading to a stall and ultimately the crash. All 29 people on board perished.
It's another stark reminder of how unforgiving these conditions can be, especially for smaller aircraft.
This accident reinforced the need for extra caution in those smaller planes, particularly in icing conditions. It also underscored the limitations of certain de-icing systems. Even when procedures are followed, the technology itself might not be enough.
It's a complex equation. The weather, the aircraft, the procedures, the pilot's judgment. All these factors have to align to ensure a safe flight.
It's a testament to the skill and professionalism of those who fly that these events are relatively rare, but they serve as constant reminders of the ever-present risks.
It's been a heavy but necessary conversation. As we wrap up, what's the most important takeaway you want our listeners to leave with?
That while the threat is real and the consequences can be severe, icing is a manageable challenge. By understanding the science, the procedures, and learning from the past, we can all contribute to safer skies.
Well said. And I hope our listeners, like me, now have a deeper appreciation for the incredible expertise it takes to navigate those icy challenges up there.
Knowledge is power, and the more we understand about the complexities of flight, the more confident and informed we can all be.
Thank you for sharing your insights. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back with more explorations into the world of aviation soon. Until then, safe travels.